What I want to do in this lesson is talk about the concept of subcultures within school and within the education system. And we're going to talk a little bit about the sociology of subcultures more generally, and then talk about how we can apply this thinking to schools and education, and talk about where and why subcultures seem to develop in schools. So we're going to talk about the more broad understanding of what subcultures are, and then we'll introduce this into the logic of the education system and how we can apply this kind of thinking to education to try and have a better sociological understanding of education. And then we will explore a number of intersectional ideas relating to the concept of subcultures, whether or not ethnicity is a factor in creation of subcultures, or maybe social class, or maybe the ways in which classes are organized. And we will be drawing on some of the thinking that we did in the last lesson, talking about the different ways in which we can organize children within education in different ways and in different systems. So, in its most simple form, the most simple definition describes a subculture as a group of people who will share common ideas and beliefs, and these common ideas and beliefs might be, but not necessarily, are different to the mainstream culture. Now, the reason why I say not necessarily, is because within the school system, the mainstream culture is something that's quite difficult to define, and we tend to have quite a lot of different subcultures that exist within schools. So, in the context of schools, subcultures exist as groups of students who share common beliefs. This is quite a simple thing to understand. And we can think about how these groups are formed, and we can define them as generally there are often common groups and common subcultures that exist within the education system. So you could have, for example, sporty students, or quote-unquote nerdy students, for example. I'm using inverted commas there because nerdy seems to imply some kind of pejorative aspect to that concept, but in reality there's no pejorative at all to in any way be nerdy, but common culture in society generally tends to understand the idea of nerdy, or being a nerd, or nerdiness, as some kind of pejorative, which is not the case at all. And sociologists have found that different school subcultures have had different impacts on the educational achievements within schools, within students within these cultures. So there are some cultures that tend to have an adverse effect in the abilities of the students within those subcultures in schools. So some might do worse off because of, or at least as a contributing factor, being part of one of these different kinds of subcultures within the education system. Now, ultimately, the two broadest subcultures that exist that are a lot less explicit than the ones we looked at in the previous slide, talking about sporty kids or nerdy kids, for example. But the two broader subcultures that exist include the idea of the kind of pro-school versus anti-school subcultures. And the reason why these are so broad and less explicit is because they can encompass a lot of different kinds of students that may form their own subcultures based around these different kinds of characteristics that are separate to other subcultures. There could be multiple different kinds of anti-school subcultures that exist within schools. So we have to, suggest that these are quite broad structures. Now, there are a number of interesting sociological questions that can be asked about the concept of subcultures in schools, and we're going to finish this lesson by talking about the probably the most interesting of these, which is how and why students form subcultures in these schools. So the reason why is tangentially related to the reason how. We're talking about what factors contribute the creation of different subcultures and the creation of, or at least the assignment, if you will, of students into different subcultures. So it seems to be the case that there are different characteristics that might associate you more with one subculture versus a different subculture. Now, what are these characteristics? How can we determine these characteristics in any meaningful sense? And ultimately, from the perspective of sociology, there's evidence that a number of different factors, a number of different intersectional factors contribute to this kind of development of students into different subcultures. And we'll begin by looking at the first idea, and this is the idea of the organizational structure of children within classrooms as being a contributing factor to the development of subcultures. And this was an explanation for school subcultures that was developed by Lacey, in 1970, and is known as the method of streaming. Now, if you think back to the last lesson, we talked about streaming as a method of organization of children in classrooms. Don't forget, we talked about streaming, we talked about setting as well, and we also talked about the idea of based on academic achievement being part of the reasons of how we be able to delineate students in classrooms. Well, Lacey conducted their research in a grammar school in the 1970s, and despite the fact, or maybe the late 1960s, early 1970s, and despite the fact that they had done research into arguably traditionally quote-unquote bright students, so students who tended to achieve quite high grades or generally were relatively more academic than other students, because of the method of streaming, because of the ways in which we see the children being delineated into different classrooms, they still nonetheless developed an anti-school subculture, despite the fact that this went against the traditional understanding of them students being arguably pro-school because of their general affinity for being quite academic. Another example of a potential motivation or a potential justification, or ultimately just the how and why of certain kids in certain subcultures, is to understand it along the lines of ethnicity. So according to research done by Fuller in 1984, it was suggested that subcultures could develop along ethnic lines rather than along developing relating to the different methods of class, as in classroom delineation, like the streaming method, for example. And their research involved a number of Year 11 black girls at a comprehensive school. And despite the fact that their abilities were high, and again they were considered to be a number of bright students within the school, they still believed that the teachers were at least racist, or maybe even exhibited some kind of racial bias against them within the classroom. And as such, this informed their development of their own subculture. They did not work for the approval of the teachers at this point, instead opting for a subculture where they internalized their success and decided to work alone for themselves effectively. And this can lead to a differential achievement within schools, because you can have a situation where if the teachers, or if you believe a teacher is exhibiting some kind of racial bias towards you, and you could develop potentially an anti-school subculture as a result of that, and this can lead to your achievement being affected, either positively or negatively. Finally, we have the idea of social class and subcultures. This gives another example or another explanation for how and why children often form or often fall into different subcultures within schools. And this is according to research done by Willis in 1997. They argued that subcultures could develop along the lines of social class. Now, this is something that can be broadly split into even further intersectional, because arguably class can be informed by a number of other things, such as racial bias and ethnicity as well. So we can actually say that these two studies, the previous two studies, actually can fit together in a way, because arguably in the United Kingdom, if you are of a certain ethnic background, you are more likely to be of a certain social class. So therefore, that's why we are developing this idea of an intersectional approach to sociology. But ultimately, Willis in 1997 studied a number of boys who had formed an anti-school subculture, and it was found that what they did within the anti-boys subculture was gain respect from others within the group by being deliberately disruptive in lessons, and this obviously would have an impact on their achievement within the classroom and their achievement within schools. But it was found that when it came to researching the social class of these students, because they were or working class and likely to go into more manual work in the future and be less likely to go on to further education, like university, for example, They did not acknowledge the value of education within the school, and they believed that the school would not help them in the future. So we can see that those who are of a lower social class, who may be more likely to enter into a world of work that is, more manual labor, for example, they're less likely to go on and do higher education. And as such, they might not even see the value of school and education in the same kind of way as somebody who does want to go on to university, for example. And that can lead to an anti-school subculture, and again have a negative impact on the grades and the ultimate achievement that these people will ultimately get. And so therefore we can see how social class can have a negative impact on the achievement of students within schools, and that we can see how it can form and develop into an anti-school subculture.